The house greeted us with the hollow sound of dripping water. Puddles spread across the floor, and the old linoleum was buckled from the dampness. I walked further in, and the cold, musty smell overwhelmed me. Tom stood in the middle of the room frowning, his arms crossed. "How are we supposed to live here?" he asked, but I didn't have an answer. The day had started like any other, but it was ending far from normal. A flood. And not just a leaky faucet. No, old pipes had burst, water pouring from the walls and ceiling, turning our cozy home into an uninhabitable mess. "We'll try calling for repairs," I suggested, though I didn't believe it would make much of a difference. Tom nodded, but I could tell he was already considering where we might stay while the repairs were underway. My thoughts were scattered, but then Rachel came to mind. She'd sent me a text just recently, short, neutral, asking how we were doing. I stared at my phone, and the idea of staying with her came almost immediately. Why not? Her house was large, she lived alone, and we were in a crisis. "You think she'd agree?" Tom asked, his expression thoughtful when I shared my idea. "It's worth a try," I shrugged. I dialed her number. She answered almost immediately. "Hi, Aunt Julia." Her voice was calm, even. I explained the situation, mentioned that the repairs might take some time, and carefully asked if it would be okay for us to stay with her for a while. Rachel hesitated for a moment, but then she agreed. "Of course. Come over," she said simply. Her words were a relief. Tom immediately started packing, and within hours we were speeding down the countryside highway. Rachel's house greeted us with a nearly perfect picture, a cozy wooden cottage surrounded by pines. But the silence around it was so thick it seemed to permeate the air. I glanced at Tom. He looked tense but said nothing. Rachel opened the door just as we climbed the steps. She appeared as calm and modest as ever, a simple linen dress, dark hair in a braid. Her greeting was brief, but I noticed a faint shadow of doubt in her eyes as she hugged me. "Thanks for taking us in," I said as I stepped inside. "No problem," Rachel replied, leading us into the house. Inside, everything was just as perfect. Wooden walls, soft lighting, cozy furniture. It seemed as though nothing had ever disturbed this peace, but that feeling was deceptive. Within minutes, I noticed Tom pausing as he carried the suitcases, his gaze lingering on Rachel. She stood by the window, her fingers brushing the curtain, looking almost serene. "Tom, just leave it in the living room," I interrupted him. He turned away and busied himself unpacking. Later, in the kitchen, something strange happened. While setting the table, Rachel accidentally dropped a glass. Tom stepped in to help. Their hands met, and I noticed his fingers linger on hers a moment longer than necessary. She gave a faint smile, but her eyes held something else. Caution, perhaps. "It's just a glass, Julia," Tom said with a light laugh, catching my look. I nodded, trying not to show how much the moment unsettled me. That evening, I saw Tom offer to help Rachel with her garden. Their conversation drifted through the open window, muffled but cheerful. I tried not to read too much into it, but the feeling that I was only seeing part of the picture wouldn't leave me. Lying in bed that night, I tried to sort through my emotions. It was hard to tell if it was just the exhaustion of the day or the start of something more. Dinner started quietly. I sat at the table watching as Tom arranged the silverware, while Rachel carefully plated the dishes she had prepared. Her movements were smooth, deliberate, as if every action held a special meaning. "You're a wonderful cook," Tom complimented her, taking a bite of the baked fish. Rachel lowered her eyes and only nodded in response. The conversation at first revolved around trivialities, the repairs, the road, plans for the coming weeks. But soon the topic shifted toward Rachel's past. "How was life in the monastery?" Tom asked, his tone seemingly casual, though it carried an unusual liveliness. Rachel glanced up, holding his gaze for a moment as if deciding whether to answer. "It was a valuable experience," she finally said. "Valuable?" Tom chuckled, clearly dissatisfied with her brief reply. "I always imagined monasteries as dull, full of prayers and monotony." Rachel shrugged slightly, but to my surprise replied, "It could be dull, sometimes challenging. Of course, there was a lack of—" She paused, avoiding our eyes. "Human warmth." Her voice was calm, but I noticed a faint blush coloring her cheeks. She avoided Tom's gaze, but he, on the other hand, looked at her with unhidden interest. "That's understandable," he nodded, his voice softening. "We all need care." His words were ordinary, but combined with the way he said them, I felt a strange unease. I turned my attention to my plate, hoping the moment would pass unnoticed. Later that evening, as I cleared the table, I couldn't shake the memory of that conversation. Was I imagining things? Perhaps I was just too tired from the stress of the repairs and the move. But the image of Tom's lingering gaze at Rachel replayed in my mind. I thought about our relationship. We had been together for nearly 20 years. Tom was a good husband, reliable, attentive, but in recent years, a certain coldness had crept into our marriage. At first, I dismissed it, attributing it to age or the monotony of daily life. But now I realized that I had been missing his gaze, his touch, his genuine interest for a long time. Still, the idea of him being attracted to Rachel seemed absurd. She was his niece, and Tom had always been someone who valued family traditions deeply. The next day, I saw them together in the garden. Tom had offered to help Rachel tidy up the flower beds. I stayed inside, busy with my own tasks. But as I passed by the window, I stopped. They stood close, and Tom, laughing, adjusted her straw hat. His hand lingered on her shoulders a moment longer than necessary. Rachel smiled but looked noticeably flustered. I felt a tightness in my chest. Perhaps it was entirely innocent. Perhaps it was all a product of my imagination. But that day left me in a state of uneasy confusion, forcing me to revisit my thoughts again and again. The morning was warm and clear. Sunlight streamed through the curtains, dancing on the wooden walls. But I couldn't feel at peace. The unease that had settled over me during last night's dinner refused to let go. After breakfast, I suggested to Tom that we take a walk in the garden. I wanted not only to clear my head, but also to talk about the repairs, our plans, and what was happening between us. Tom agreed, carrying his half-empty coffee mug, and we stepped outside. The garden was beautiful, well-kept, with flower beds and winding pathways. Yet, despite the tranquility surrounding us, there was a tension between us. "I think the repairs will take longer than we planned," I began, trying to start the conversation. "Yeah, seems like it," Tom replied, staring into the distance, clearly lost in his own thoughts. I decided to approach the topic carefully. "It's good we have Rachel," I said, attempting a smile. "She's always been so independent." Tom nodded, but his response made me uneasy. "She seems very genuine and bright. You don't meet people like her often," he said, his voice soft, as though he were talking about something deeply important to him. Genuine? Bright? I looked at him, trying to gauge the seriousness of his words. "Yeah," he glanced at me and shrugged, seemingly unaware of my tone. "She's like she doesn't belong to this world." The conversation left me with a strange feeling. Tom spoke about Rachel in a way he had never spoken about me or anyone else. Maybe I was overreacting, but his words stayed with me. After our walk, I headed to the kitchen to make tea, but as I entered, I saw Rachel. She was sitting at the table, her hands nervously twisting the edge of the tablecloth. She looked so distraught that I froze for a moment. "Is everything okay?" I asked, trying not to sound too concerned. Rachel flinched, as though she had just noticed me. "Yes, everything's fine," she said quickly, but her voice was unconvincing. I sat across from her, trying to meet her gaze, but she avoided my eyes. "Are you sure? You seem unsettled." "Tom was telling me about his work," she interrupted, as though eager to change the subject. "I just didn't quite understand everything." "His work?" My surprise was genuine. Tom rarely discussed his work, even with me. Rachel nodded but didn't elaborate. She stood abruptly, clearly wanting to leave. "I have things to do," she muttered over her shoulder and disappeared, leaving me alone with my growing suspicions. I stayed seated, processing what I had just seen. Her behavior didn't match the image I had of her. Rachel had always been reserved, almost stubbornly so in her need to keep things to herself. But now there was something new. Anxiety, confusion, which she was clearly trying to hide. I spent the rest of the day deep in thought, wondering if I was overreacting. But that evening I saw them together again. Tom was speaking to Rachel on the terrace. She laughed, but her laugh seemed forced. Tom rested his hand on her shoulder, and I noticed how she flinched slightly but didn't pull away. My unease grew. These were small things, insignificant on their own, but there were too many of them to ignore. The evening began with Tom's suggestion to have a family game night. He brought it up during dinner, as though trying to lighten the mood. "Rachel has so many board games. Why don't we play? It might take our minds off everything," he said, addressing her more than me. I nodded. Refusing would have seemed odd, and I didn't want to create tension. Rachel brought out several boxes of games, and we laid them on the table in the living room. I watched as Tom enthusiastically explained the rules. His voice was lively, his eyes bright. Rachel, sitting across from him, replied in short sentences, but her smile was warmer than usual. The game progressed, but I hardly noticed the time. My thoughts were fixed on what I was witnessing. Tom laughed at Rachel's jokes, though they seemed utterly ordinary to me. When I tried to contribute to the conversation, it was as if he didn't hear me, continuing to focus on her. "Another win for Rachel," Tom announced with a grin, clapping her hand as though it was some long-standing tradition. I felt like an outsider at the table. Everything seemed innocent, yet it left a bitter taste. When the game ended, I excused myself, claiming I was tired, and went to the bedroom. The room was dark, with only the moonlight filtering through the curtains, but I didn't feel like lying down. I sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the quiet of the house. Passing by Rachel's room, I paused, hearing a faint whisper. Her voice was barely audible, but clear enough to catch the words. "Give me strength to let go of these doubts. I don't want this." Her voice trembled as if she were fighting with herself. I stood in the hallway, unsure whether to knock or enter. What did she mean? Her words sounded as though she was hiding something, but I couldn't decipher what. That night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling, replaying everything that had happened over the past few days. The unease grew, but I lacked the certainty to act. The next morning, Tom noticed my cold demeanor. "You seem distant," he said as we set the table together. "Don't you think you're spending too much time with Rachel?" I asked, trying to keep my tone calm. Tom stopped and looked at me with mild irritation. "Are you serious?" he scoffed. "You're the one who suggested we stay here." His tone was almost mocking, and I felt anger rising within me. "I did, but that doesn't mean I don't see what's happening," I replied, trying not to raise my voice. Tom waved me off. "You're imagining things. Rachel's just helping us, and you're overthinking it." I stayed silent, feeling him pull away as if my concerns and feelings were insignificant. That conversation only deepened my unease. Everything I had seen, everything I felt, seemed too real to be a figment of my imagination. The evening seemed calm. The sun had almost set, casting warm orange hues over the horizon. I was cleaning the kitchen after dinner when I noticed Tom and Rachel were nowhere to be seen. Their absence immediately unsettled me, though I tried to convince myself everything was fine. Walking into the living room, I stopped at the doorway. They were sitting on the couch, too close to each other. Their knees almost touched, and their hands rested just inches apart. Tom was speaking in a low, soft voice, while Rachel sat with her eyes downcast, clearly flustered. My first reaction was shock. It looked strange, unnatural. I wanted to step in, pretend I hadn't noticed anything, but my feet were frozen in place. Suddenly, Rachel stood up abruptly, as if his words had upset her. She rushed out of the room, and I heard the terrace door slam. Tom stayed seated for a moment, then got up and followed her. I stepped outside quietly, careful not to make a sound. Hiding near the door, I watched them in the garden. Rachel turned to face him, her expression tense, her gestures nervous. Tom placed a hand on her shoulder, speaking to her softly. He looked calm, almost comforting. At one point, he leaned in closer, and I saw his face nearly touch hers. In the dim light, I thought he was simply hugging her to reassure her. The gesture seemed unexpected, but not enough to immediately raise suspicion. At that moment, I had no idea he had kissed her, I would recall later. If I had known what had happened in that instant, I probably would have packed my things and left that very night. Rachel suddenly stepped back sharply, but she didn't leave right away. She stood there, torn between walking away and saying something. Finally, she turned and ran deeper into the garden. Tom remained where he was, his arms falling limply to his sides. I went back inside with my heart pounding. It all felt like a bad dream. I couldn't believe what I had seen. Tom, always so reserved, so serious, now looked like a completely different man. His warmth, his softness. It was all directed at her. Sitting in our bedroom, I felt the walls closing in on me. If I had known then that it wasn't just a comforting gesture, but a kiss, I would have made the decision to leave right then and there. But at that moment, I was confused. My mind clung to the slightest justifications. Maybe it was just his way of comforting her. Maybe I was imagining things. Should I confront him? But what could I say? I had no proof, only a growing sense of dread that was becoming impossible to ignore. That night I lay awake, lost in restless thoughts. The dinner with neighbors had been planned in advance. Tom was surprisingly cheerful and welcoming, as if nothing had happened. His voice was lively and he joked easily, keeping the conversation flowing. Rachel, on the other hand, looked tense. She spoke only when addressed, avoided meeting his gaze, and sat a bit farther away than usual. I watched them, trying not to show my emotions. I wanted to scream, to ask how he could act so carefree after what I had seen. But instead, I gripped my wineglass tighter. "Rachel, have you lived here long?" one of the neighbors asked, a kind-faced man in his 50s. "Only a few months," she replied quietly. "This is such a lovely house," his wife added. "You must have done a lot of it yourself?" Rachel gave a faint smile and nodded. "Yes, a lot. I wanted it to feel cozy." Tom jumped in, praising her abilities. His voice sounded overly enthusiastic, and I felt my anger grow. After dinner, I excused myself and went upstairs, unable to sit at the table any longer. I couldn't bear to listen to Tom's pleasant conversations, pretending everything was normal. Later, I heard Rachel retreat to her room. As I passed by her door, I noticed it was slightly ajar. Peeking inside, I saw her sitting at a desk with a notebook open in front of her. Her shoulders were tense, and her hand moved nervously across the page. "Forgive me for these thoughts. I can't stop them," she whispered, unaware of my presence. I stepped back, my heart sinking at her words. Her voice was filled with pain, as though she was battling herself. That night, I decided I couldn't stay silent any longer. When Tom came into the bedroom, I was sitting on the bed, waiting for him. "Do you really think I don't notice?" I asked, barely keeping my voice steady. He looked at me, puzzled. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about you and Rachel. You spend too much time with her. You pay more attention to her than you do to me." Tom sighed as if the conversation bored him. "Julia, that's ridiculous. You know how that sounds? She's your niece." "That doesn't explain how you act around her. I see how you look at her, how you seek her company." His face darkened, but he continued to deny it. "You're imagining things. I haven't done anything. If you're jealous, that's your problem," he said coldly, his tone distant. "Jealous?" I scoffed bitterly. "Is that what you call it?" Our words were like blows, wounding each other deeper with every exchange. At some point, he turned away, clearly tired of the conversation. "I'm done talking about this," he said, lying down in bed. I felt the wall between us grow. We lay back to back, and in the silence of the night, I could feel our marriage cracking under the weight of everything left unsaid. The morning began with an unexpected suggestion from Rachel. "Aunt Julia, would you like to go to town? I need to pick up a few things, and it's boring to go alone." Her voice was almost hesitant, and for a moment I wondered what was behind the invitation. There was no reason to refuse. I agreed, hoping the trip might give me some insight into what was on her mind. The drive to town was quiet. Rachel stared out the window, avoiding my gaze. I tried to make small talk, but her answers were brief and cautious, as though she was afraid to say too much. "You've been spending a lot of time with Tom," I finally said, unable to hold back. She flinched as though she hadn't expected it. "He's just a good person," she replied quickly. "Always willing to help, to support." "Good." I glanced at her, trying to keep my tone calm. "Then why do I feel increasingly like an outsider?" Rachel didn't reply immediately. Her face remained calm, but I noticed her fingers nervously fidgeting with the hem of her dress. "Aunt Julia, I think you're misunderstanding things," she said softly. but her words were unconvincing. I looked at this modest young woman, her downcast eyes, and couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something. Beneath her quiet voice and nervous demeanor lay desires she was too afraid to admit, even to herself. When we entered the supermarket, I tried to focus on the shopping, but my eyes kept drifting back to Rachel. She suddenly froze, pulled her phone from her bag, and stared at the screen. I noticed how her face lit up with a smile, so genuine that it sent a chill through me. Someone had clearly sent her something pleasant. "Something important?" I asked, trying to sound neutral. Rachel immediately lowered the phone, her face turning pale. "No, nothing," she said, hurriedly slipping the device back into her bag. But it took only a second for me to realize she was lying. "Who was it?" My voice was firmer now. "Just a friend," she said, trying to appear calm, but her eyes betrayed her. On the drive home, I barely restrained myself from asking more. A picture was already forming in my mind, but I lacked the evidence to confront her. As soon as we returned, I went straight to find Tom. He was in the living room with his laptop, immersed in work. "Let me see your phone," I said, walking into the room. He looked up at me, surprised and slightly irritated. "Why?" "I just want to check." "Julia, this is ridiculous." He set the laptop aside and crossed his arms. "You don't trust me? After everything I've seen, I can't trust you." "You've seen?" He laughed, but there was no humor in his voice. "What have you seen?" "You spend too much time with Rachel, and I want to know what you're saying to her, what you're texting." "This is absurd." He stood up. "I'm not going to prove anything to you." His refusal only deepened my sense of isolation. Once again, I felt alone, surrounded by walls of secrecy and denial. Soft sunlight streamed through the windows, filling the kitchen with a warm glow. Rachel unexpectedly suggested hosting a family lunch. "I think it might help lighten the mood," she said with a demure smile, avoiding my gaze. Tom immediately supported her idea, and I simply nodded, unwilling to argue. Internally, I felt tense, but I decided this might actually help ease the growing tension. Preparation went smoothly. Tom and Rachel bustled in the kitchen, chatting about recipes. Their conversation was light and playful. I stood to the side, watching as Tom leaned in closer to hear her quiet voice as she smiled back at him. In that moment, I felt like an outsider in my own home. When we finally sat down for lunch, I tried to focus on the food. Rachel had done an excellent job. Appetizers, the main course, dessert, everything was perfect. But I couldn't truly appreciate her efforts. My attention was fixed on Tom. He sat across from me, occasionally stealing glances at Rachel. Those glances were too long, too deliberate. Rachel, for her part, avoided looking directly at him, but her modest smile and downcast eyes spoke volumes. "This is an amazing lunch, Rachel," Tom said, raising his glass of wine. "Thank you," she replied, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. After lunch, Tom excused himself, saying he wanted to rest. I stayed to help Rachel clear the table, my mind racing with thoughts about his behavior. A few minutes later, I heard muffled voices. Following the sound, I approached Rachel's room. The door was slightly ajar. Tom was standing too close to her. His hand rested on the back of her chair, and his head was tilted toward her ear. He was whispering something, his voice low and calm. "You're wonderful, Rachel. I understand how hard this must be for you." I caught a fragment of his words. She looked flustered, but her eyes held something else. Interest, curiosity. My heart pounded, and I couldn't stay silent any longer. "What are you doing here?" My voice came out louder than I intended. They both turned to look at me. Tom straightened up, his face shifting to an irritated expression. "We were just talking, Julia," he said calmly, but his tone was cold. "Talking?" I scoffed bitterly. "Alone in her room?" "You're seeing things that aren't there," he said as he walked past me. "I'm tired of your baseless accusations." He left the room, leaving Rachel and me alone. I turned to her. She looked flustered, unsure of what to say. "What was that, Rachel?" I asked, sinking into a chair. She nervously tucked her hair behind her ear and lowered her gaze. "Aunt Julia, you misunderstood," she began softly. "Tom was just asking how I'm feeling." "And for that, he had to whisper in your ear?" My voice wavered. He didn't want anyone to overhear. Her excuses sounded weak. Why do you let him get so close? I couldn't hide the reproach in my voice. I don't let him, she protested, her voice trembling. Tom, he's just trying to support me. I studied her closely, searching for any sign of deceit, but her face only showed embarrassment and unease. You're thinking the worst of me, she continued. I'm a nun. How could I want anything inappropriate? Her words sounded almost convincing. My anger began to fade, replaced by doubt. I didn't mean anything wrong, she added. Please don't think badly of me. Her voice was soft, almost pleading. I exhaled, feeling drained. Fine, I said, standing up, but no more situations like this. Rachel nodded, and I left her room feeling as though I'd gained more questions than answers. The house was cloaked in the stillness of night, broken only by the occasional rustle of the wind outside the windows. I lay in bed, trying to calm the storm of unease that had plagued me for days. Tom slept beside me, his breathing steady and deep. But my thoughts were restless, replaying every suspicion, every glance, every careless touch I had seen between him and Rachel. I was nearly drifting off when I heard a noise. The faint creak of a door, followed by soft footsteps in the hallway. My heart clenched. I quietly got up, careful not to wake Tom, and stepped out of the bedroom. The sound came from Rachel's room. Her door was slightly ajar, and a dim light spilled out through the crack. I moved closer, my heart pounding in my chest. Peering inside, I froze. Tom was sitting on the edge of her bed, his face close to hers. He was speaking softly, but I couldn't make out the words. Rachel looked flustered, her hands nervously clutching the edge of the blanket. This is wrong, I heard her voice, shaky and uncertain. But Tom leaned in closer, his hand resting on her shoulder. You feel it too, Rachel. Why deny it? His voice was low, almost a whisper. I wanted to leave, to run, but my feet were rooted to the floor. I couldn't tear my eyes away. Tom pulled her closer, his lips meeting hers. She tried to pull away at first, but he didn't let her. Her resistance lasted only a moment before she gave in, her hands rising to wrap around his shoulders. I watched as they melted into a kiss that quickly grew more intense. Tom lay down beside her on the bed, their movements becoming urgent, filled with raw desire. My mind refused to process what I was seeing. Him, my husband, with her in bed. Rachel, the same woman who swore she wanted nothing. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead. At some point, I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and ran back to my bedroom. Slamming the door shut behind me, I leaned against it, struggling to catch my breath. My body was trembling, my heart pounding as though it would burst out of my chest. I couldn't believe this was happening. If someone had told me this, I would have dismissed it as a ridiculous fabrication, but I had seen it with my own eyes. That night, I couldn't sleep. The images from Rachel's room played over and over in my mind, vivid and haunting. I wrestled with what to do next. Ignore it? Pretend it hadn't happened? No, that was impossible. By morning, I knew what I had to do. Rachel had to go. I wouldn't let her destroy my family. The light inside the church was soft and muted, stained glass windows casting colorful shadows on the floor. I stood before the priest, feeling my hands tremble. This moment felt surreal, but I knew there was no other choice. Father Michael, I need to speak with you. My voice was quiet but firm. The priest looked at me with sympathy and nodded. We sat down on one of the wooden pews and I began to speak. The words poured out, about what I had seen, about how betrayed I felt, and finally about how someone whose trust should have been unshakable had crossed every imaginable boundary. I know Rachel spent a long time in the monastery, I said, barely holding back tears. But her behavior, it's destroying my family. The priest listened silently, his face calm, but I could see he was disturbed. Julia, I understand your pain, he finally said, but this must be addressed. Silence will only make things worse. His words confirmed that I was doing the right thing. I knew a scandal was inevitable, but it no longer mattered. When I returned home, I felt the tension in the air like a physical weight. Tom was waiting for me in the living room. His face was a mixture of irritation and exhaustion. Where have you been? His voice was sharp. At the church, I replied, not hiding my sarcasm. He frowned but said nothing. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. "I saw everything, Tom. You and Rachel, in her room, on her bed." The words hit him like a blow, but he quickly composed himself. "It's not what you think," he began, but I cut him off. "Enough. I'm tired of your lies. Julia, please listen to me." His voice softened, but I no longer cared. "I don't want to hear anything else," I said firmly. "You betrayed me, not just as a husband, but as a person." Tom fell silent, lowering his head. He looked lost, but I felt no pity. "You can stay with her if that's what you want, but for me, both of you no longer exist." The days after my visit to the church marked the beginning of the end. News spread quickly and Rachel's reputation was destroyed. Her friends and acquaintances began avoiding her, condemning her actions. I watched it all with bitterness and a sense of relief. She deserved it. Tom tried to make amends, but I couldn't bear to see him. Every time I looked at him, I remembered that night and the pain came rushing back. Eventually, I decided to leave. The house, full of memories, was no longer a refuge for me. Living alone in a small rented apartment, I felt free for the first time in a long while. Yes, I had lost much. My husband, my faith in people, the comfort of family. But I knew I had done the right thing. Now there was no more deceit in my life. Just me in the silence, bringing both pain and solace.